wanted to kick off by asking each of you in turn why it is that we've been faced with this title this morning, an Unholy Alliance. Why is that something that one might associate with the relationship between museums and the art trade? Antonia.
I suppose I would say that in Britain and in the Anglophone world, the alliance between the art market and the museum has been a bit closer than it has in other parts of Europe. That sort of easy discussion and sort of collaboration, in a sense, on building a collection hasn't pertained in quite the same way. We do know that sort of over the last 100 or so years, there have been occasions when great sort of agents and dealers have really sort of gone beyond their brief with thought of Devine. Nonetheless, even when sort of going rogue, so to speak, in their profession, what they have brought to the collections that they've helped to form, even by less than scrupulous means, I think outweighs that behavior.
Let me pose the same question to Martin. Do you feel that you are one side of an unholy alliance, Martin?
Well, I don't want to not be controversial so early in this discussion, but actually I don't think that today it is an unholy alliance. I'd echo what Antonia said. I think that the market and the museum world now works very closely together. And again, Antonia's absolutely right. I think that the UK museum world was the first to really embrace this. But I would say over the period in which I've been a dealer, and I'm very fortunate that I came into an established firm that already had an established relationship of working with museums. But the relationship with museums in the States, across the rest of Europe, and further afield, is one that's become ever closer and beneficial in both directions.
There must be a reason why this sense that there was some sort of ethical friction, as it were, in the relationship between the trade and museums came about. So let's think, first of all, about, I suppose, some of the more successful collaborations that have really been integral to the foundation of historical museums and collections. Antonia, could you perhaps say a little bit about some of the most striking examples historically?
Well, it's much nicer to talk about than those that haven't worked. And of course, I'm sitting next to a dear colleague and friend, Martin, whose family and the firm, over 4 generations, as you've mentioned, have really helped to create some of the great collections of 19th, 18th and 19th, and particularly 19th century at this moment, I think, collections. But I was writing a list of dealers that we all know by name, and that it happens are just about all represented at TEFAF. So I think that speaks both to their enormous prestige and to the prestige of TEFAF itself. And this is not meant to be an endorsement of TEFAF by any means, but it does show that it is one of the great art fairs where you can see the best works all at once. I mean, just the sort of roll call: Agnew's, Colnaghi, Fine Art Society, Blairman, Kugel, Danny Katz, Fogg, Ledrière, Blumka, Röbig, Noise and Moiti. And, about half or more of those have been multi-generational. Blumka sort of holds the entrance to TEFAF after all. I think all of us would agree that those dealers and many of the personalities within them, because they're not just one sort of uniform dealer, there are personalities within them, people that we all know and work so closely with, have really helped us. And I mean, just going back to Martin, we've invited Martin to join us on one of the brainstorming sessions for our future plan for the 19th century European galleries, which will be in this very space, actually. It isn't simply about finding objects for the collections, but it's also about the scholarship behind it.
Further back, in the 19th century, was there this strict distinction between what might be who might be a dealer and who might be a collector and a founder of a museum. I'm thinking particularly of people like Noel Desenfants and Dulwich, the great collector, dealer who eventually becomes one of the founders of the museum.
Well, I think in this museum, a prime example would be John Webb, who was very much involved in advising the museum and whose collection eventually came to the museum on his death. At the turn of the century, Henshaw, whose collection ended up in the Metropolitan and is still a substantial and somewhat under-researched part of their holdings. Another example, I think, of a dealer who was influential on the formation of collections was C.T. Liu, the great dealer in Asian art, who worked closely with Lawrence Sickman in one of Antonia's former museums at the Nelson Atkins, in forming one of the great collections of Asian art in an American museum.
Obviously, the sense of being straight in business and having a feeling of mentorship are two things that we might come on to a little bit further later in the discussion. I just wanted to press this idea a little bit more of what it might mean not to be straight in business and where those collaborations have sometimes more than come a cropper, but actually tainted the idea of what this type of collaborative work can mean. And you mentioned Joseph Duveen, Antonia. Would you say that Duveen really stands out as the figure of the rogue dealer who perhaps, at least certainly as his reputation has been reconsidered in the last few decades, has come to sort of taint the idea of what the trade and museums can do together?
Perhaps, but I think perhaps our sort of revisionism about him or about dealers or the sort of new attitude comes also from a new interest in the whole history of dealing and collecting, which is something that also Clive and Martin and a whole host of academics are pursuing, back to the sort of 16th, 17th century fairs in Antwerp. So it's interesting that TEFAF is not that far from Antwerp.
We do have the Frick, we do have the Huntington, and those are extraordinary accumulations of wonderful paintings that we wouldn't have had but for the tenacity of a Duveen. And for sure, he was a flawed figure and very a great deal of self-interest. I think that what we would both agree now is that the nature of dealing has changed, has become far more transparent. And I think that the sort of flaws that occurred during the Duveen era are probably ones that both sides of this alliance would not see happen in the present time.
Let's move on, because Martin, you have mentioned how much your experience of various mentors meant to you in terms of your work. It strikes me that perhaps at the senior levels in museums, there is often a very close interplay and exchange of knowledge and respect between museums and the trade. But I wonder, it's something we've talked about in the past, whether at the sort of lower levels, particularly people who perhaps are coming out of university, junior art historians, assistant curators, there is perhaps enough opportunity for those people to share the knowledge of senior art dealers. Martin?
Yes, I think that's very much a live issue. If one takes the very simple fact that there's far less money available now within museum departments, both here and across the world, for younger curators to travel, it's ever more important that they're given every opportunity possible to get beyond the walls of the museum, to meet people, and to see things, to handle things. And I think we're all aware that there has been quite a strong move within the teaching of art history in universities away from objects to the more theoretical. And I think once people come into the museum world, it's essential that they have a proper relationship with the objects themselves. And one of the things that has happened is that various groups, and you mentioned the Furniture History Society, that group over the last number of years has sponsored a handful of younger curators, younger museum professionals, to go to TEFAF in Maastricht, simply to spend 2 days looking at objects, handling objects, meeting the people who are the merchants in those things, but also meeting colleagues from other institutions around the world. And all those are extremely important things that the market can offer back to the museum world.
It is notable at TEFAF Maastricht that you may see many curators from US museums, from European museums, but a paucity of curators from museums in this country.
That is right, and I think you're right as well, that both travel funds and also acquisition funds do hold one back, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be encouraging people as much as possible. Also, it's actually quite cost effective, as sort of mercenary as it sounds, because if you stand at the Place de la Concorde or whichever of the cross points at TEFAF, you meet just about all your colleagues at some point during the first 2 days, either from the States or from Europe. It's a very, very good place to network and catch up with colleagues as well as to see the best works on the market.
Martin, you spoke about handling objects and that sense of touch and handling. Is that the chief thing you feel that the trade could do to support, to develop curatorial expertise, develop what it is to get a sense of the object?
Dealing with the market when it comes to acquisitions is something that understandably curators get very excited about. I mean, it is quite a thrill to bring a new object into a museum. And from my side of the fence over the time I've been involved, I've seen very, very different reactions from the experienced, very discreet approach to making acquisitions to the heart on the sleeve, very excitable approach. And I think one of the things that people with experience in the market can offer back to museums, and I've come here and spoken to groups of curators in the furniture department in the past, for example, is just to hold back, to be very restrained in your approach to that.
Antonia, can I ask you to say a little bit about your experience in perhaps some different institutions of making acquisitions through the trade or using the trade to facilitate acquisitions, how easy that has been in different cases, how you have acclimatized to it, I suppose, in many years as a curator?
I was very lucky to work at the Getty for a while. So making acquisitions was relatively easy because suddenly you had a rather substantial acquisition fund. Managing, actually, the sort of flood of offers was more of an issue because, mentioned Getty and sort of dollar signs go sort of lighting up in people's eyes. So, it gave me a certain advantage, perhaps, of being offered what was on the market. And I would say that one thing it did help, perhaps, is forming relationships with certain dealers that might be showing at TEFAF, but knowing about the object before it was, before Maastricht opened. So there was an example where we actually acquired an ivory pokal, a lidded cup, and we essentially bought it before TEFAF opened, but it was allowed to be shown at TEFAF as, reserved or sort of not for sale anymore. So that certainly allowed a certain advantage.
Does that ever lead, has that led in your experience ever to a conflict at the point of purchase where a museum is after something and perhaps your inclination is that you would love to see it in a public collection, but you know, Martin, that a private collector will be able to put the funds up by the next morning?
No. The truth is, to expand on that, if you enjoy working with museums, you know what the score is. And it's not unusual for transactions to take a year. It's not ideal, but you factor it in. I think it's factored in from both sides. I don't know of a single occasion when I would have said, oh, well, we'd rather not do that with you, the Met, or you, the V&A, because Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so is happy to come along, write out a check. It just doesn't work that way.
I just want to move the conversation on a little bit because it's a linked topic, which is how dealers might help arrange loans to museums, or how certain of their clients might act as agents, I suppose, in arranging the loan of a collection or a work to an exhibition or to a more permanent display. Do you think that there's enough due diligence done by museums in this country when that type of arrangement is made, Antonia?
We cannot borrow directly from a dealer. It should be through a trust or sort of indirect. And as far as private collections being brokered through a dealer, it's, you know, I think it's case by case. It's a rather sort of sensitive area. It has to be very carefully thought through. And I think there have to be certain caveats that should the object be withdrawn from loan, it cannot go on the market for 5 years, and various other caveats like that. Because otherwise it is seen as being, you know, part of the provenance, part of a sort of tacit approval and support of the object.
I wish that it were as clear-cut as Antonia is suggesting. And if we look back over the last number of decades, just take the Treasure Houses exhibition in Washington, which was sort of, it was suggested by many that this was basically a shop window for things in English country houses, and indeed some of the things were subsequently sold. Museums obviously hope that the collections will come to them, but there's the other side of it, that once it's got the blessing of having been shown in a major institution and it then comes to the market, which often things do, their value is enhanced.
I think you wanted to say something about the Seki Collection, which is currently on show at the Fitzwilliam Museum, many of the pieces.
That particular collection, which has been formed quietly over the last 40 or 50 years, very discreetly, but at an extraordinarily high level by a very informed couple, known to some of us in this room and well known quietly amongst the art trade and the auction houses. They have ceased living in London and are living back in Italy. And for a long time, they've really wanted to know what they should do with their collection. And should they leave it somewhere? Should they lend it somewhere? What should they do? And they discussed it with a number of members of the trade, with museum trustees, and little by little whittled it down and got to meet one or two museum directors and curators. And as a result of that discussion, both the Fitzwilliam and the Ashmolean now have on medium-term loan some remarkable works of art that have really hitherto been completely unknown to the public, and all of which are things that enhance and would enhance any museum collection.
Can I ask you both about the power, sway that certain contemporary art galleries might hold over institutions? In that the art newspaper had a big splash last year, I think it was the cover story, that something like a third of solo artist exhibitions in top museums in the United States were drawn from artists that were represented by only 5 galleries international galleries. And whether you feel, perhaps Antonia working in museums, that the contemporary galleries, certain galleries have got too much sway in terms of what might be shown in an institutional context.
I mean, I think there will be an innate sort of conflict when, as you say, a small handful of galleries dominate the market. It's a bit like sort of monopoly, isn't it? But I think it's also the nature of contemporary art. It's rather difficult, in a sense, for a contemporary artist to be represented in a museum, either through an exhibition or thing, without there being some sort of connection with the trade already, because they are still working. That in itself sets up a certain tension.
It remains for me to say thank you very much to Martin Levy and to Antonia Boström. Thank you to TEFAF and to the V&A for hosting us this morning. Do please, I'd love it if you take home your copies of Apollo, and that's one way to learn about objects in there, by subscribing. But thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this morning.
Thank you.